Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie. I am an academic coach with the Learning Center. And today we're going to be going through one of our Roads to Success presentations. This one is called Reading to Remember SQ4R, which is one of our reading strategies. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into it. I always like to get started with just an overview of what the Learning Center is. So we have our asterisks next to this first one. We usually offer on-campus tutoring. Obviously right now during remote learning, everything is virtual, but we are continuing to offer all of our tutoring services online. So you can get math, science, world language tutoring. You can make an appointment with them to do that virtually. We also offer a college success course. This is in the university studies program. It covers a lot of the same topics that we go over in coaching or in our Roads to Success presentations. But whether you're a first-year student or a senior student, you can enroll for that class. Academic coaching, my personal favorite, just because that's what I do. This is one-on-one appointments where we will talk you through some different strategies for studying, motivation, time management. And we get to know you on a one-on-one individual level, which I think is really cool. You can make an appointment for that. And obviously our Roads to Success presentations, which is what you're viewing now. So our objectives for today with SQ4R, by the end of this workshop, we're hoping you'll be able to recognize the importance of actively reading materials. You'll understand all of the components of our acronym SQ4R, and you'll feel prepared to apply these strategies to your own coursework. So starting off with a question here, normally, is reading an active or a passive activity? Give you a second to think about that one. If you've taken or you've watched our Study Smarter strategy video, you might be thinking, what is the difference between active or passive? I remember that. So generally, reading is something that is passive. We're inputting information, we're taking it in, but if we're not challenging ourselves to actively engage with the material, then that's kind of all it is. So what we're going to do today is try and make it more of an active activity. So how do we do that? We're going to take a look at our information processing model first, because this has a lot to do with, why we integrate a lot of the aspects of SQ4R. So looking at this model, you're starting with your environmental stimuli, which is an extra complicated way to just say what you're reading. It comes through your sensory memory first. So obviously the one that we're looking at here is your vision store. And then it's in your short-term memory. So this is information that you're just taking in for the moment. The best way to get things from your short-term memory to your long-term memory is through that rehearsal piece. So you're reviewing it over and over again, you're engaging with it in different ways. That's how you're going to remember it longer. So keep this rehearsal piece in mind, because now as we look at SQ4R and we kind of go through what each of those different aspects are, you'll notice that we have this circular piece in the middle. That is the rehearsal. That is why this is so important, to get some of the information that you're reading from your short-term memory to your longer-term memory. So the components of SQ4R, we're going to go through each of them in depth, but just to overview them, the first one is survey, second one is question, then read, record, relate, and review. So we'll go through each of those one step. So the first one, survey or scanning. This is your first step because you're kind of just skimming through the material, and obviously we're not stopping after step one, right? We still have Q and all the other R's to go. This is just the first step, but we're looking through the reading and getting a general overview of what we're going to be reading. So this might be looking at the organization of the chapter or the article or the slideshow. How many pages or slides are there? What are the sources? Just priming your brain for the information you're about to take in. This can also be a great time to create an outline. So if you are a person that takes notes while you're reading, you find that really helpful. This is a great time to, when you're looking through the organization, get a sense for how you're going to be taking notes. And I'll go through a couple of different ways that you can take notes. So this first type of note-taking is called Cornell. This is particularly helpful when you're trying to outline, especially if you've looked at the reading or the chapter ahead of time, because you put your keywords on the left-hand side, and then you're going to take notes as you're reading on the right-hand side. So if you're looking at a chapter, you could put the title of it at the top. On the left-hand side, you're putting all of the sections or the subheadings, and then you're going to take notes as you go through the chapter. Another type of taking notes that's maybe a little bit more common is the outline method. This is kind of, you would just go as you're reading or as you're listening to a lecture or looking at a slideshow, you have your heading and then the information below it, move on to the next heading and go down like that. These types of note-taking models are really helpful for people that are like visual text people. You enjoy lists and reading things to understand. And then we have this example here of mind mapping or concept mapping. These are for my more creative visual image people. And so this can also be a good way to outline before you start reading. You put the main idea of the article or the chapter in the center, and then where it says like key theme 1, 2, 3, that's where you're putting some of your subheadings or some of the main things they're going to be talking about. And then as you're reading, you can kind of branch off from there. So thinking about your learning style, which one of these might be the most useful for you. Then we go into step number 2, which is questioning. So this is obviously, again, before we start really diving into the reading. And this can be something you do in your head, or if you want to write it down, if again, you're a little bit more visual person, you can put it on some sticky notes. But these can either be questions that you're pulling out of your own brain, or you can use questions from, if it's a textbook, often they have questions at the beginning of the chapter or at the end, some of those review questions. So you could just take a second to look through those. What am I supposed to be getting out of this reading? And jotting down some of those, or just thinking about it again to prime yourself before you start reading through the information more in depth. Or it could be that you're looking through some of the headings and subheadings and turning them into questions yourself. So for example, if you're reading through something and say it's developmental psychology and there are different theorists or theories in the chapter, you can kind of go through and turn each one of those into questions by saying, what is so-and-so, or what is this theory, or what was so-and-so's theory on this, so that when you get to the end of the chapter, you can kind of check in with yourself and be like, okay, do I understand these really basic questions of what the main ideas were? Now, step 3, reading, we're doing the thing here. And so there's really no shortcut or way to get around this one. You are diving in this time, you're looking for emphasized words, you're looking for the answers to your questions that you set up for yourself. You're taking the time to reread any difficult passages. So maybe when you were scanning through, you noticed some really dense passages that you kind of skimmed over. Now we're taking the time to really try and read and understand and get the answers to things that were confusing the first time around. Then record or recite. This is where we're taking reading and making it from a passive activity into more of an active activity. So we are taking the time to engage with the material in some way. And again, this will look different for everyone depending on what type of learner you are. So if you are more of a visual text person, you like your note taking and your lists, you might be taking notes in that Cornell style or outline or mind mapping. If that's not your jam and you would rather kind of do kind of some of the examples you see on the screen here. Our question we have here at the bottom, which is the most effective? Hopefully this is a pretty obvious answer. B is the best way to kind of be highlighting when we're going through textbooks or taking notes, that kind of thing. We're trying to really just get the key points, highlighting or underlining. And then one little extra tip that we have on here is trying to incorporate, if you remember, and we'll go back to it in a sec, that cognitive information processing model that we looked at. When you're taking in information, it goes through your sensory memory, right, before you get to the short-term memory. So the more we can integrate as many senses as possible, the more we're kind of doing that rehearsal piece so that information is going to be processed and we're going to retain it longer. So obviously recording through writing things down, using colors, those are all your vision senses, your vision stores. But if you're able to say it out loud to yourself, if you're at home in your room, you've got your door shut, that's another way. That's your auditory processing. So you're already using your vision, your auditory processing. As many ways as you can integrate different senses is really going to be helpful. So again, coming back to these different note-taking styles that I talked about before, great way to be engaging actively with the reading. And the last one in our little circle piece of SQ4R is relate. So this is just taking a second to relate the information that you're reading to any things that you have either learned in the past, so past material either from that course, maybe not from that course, other courses you've taken, or experiences in your life, your own lived experience. The fastest way to take information from your short-term memory to your longer-term memory is to give it some type of meaning and context. You're really trying to anchor it to other pieces of information that you've learned in the past. When we are learning about things, I mean, maybe think about classes that have been super impactful to you, whether it was, your first psychology class that you took and you thought, wow, this really relates to me. I really feel something here. It was because it had some meaning to you and it was personal. And so maybe you go on to become a psych major. Maybe you had that type of experience with a science class or a university studies class that you didn't expect to like, but then it was really actually super engaging for you. When we are able to relate the things that we're learning to things that are meaningful to us, you hang on to that information way longer. So that's what we're trying to do with our reading here. Why is this important? Well, other than what I just said, again, we're coming back to this information processing model, right? And we're thinking about what is going to transfer our information from our short-term memory to our longer-term memory. I've talked about our sensory integration, we've talked about the rehearsal piece, and that last piece is really giving it some meaning so that you remember it longer. All right, last part of SQ4R is the review. So this is one that we might skip over the most because once we finish our reading, it can feel really satisfying to, close the book, move on to a different task. But what's really important is once you've finished your reading to come back to it, whether that's before class or you do your reading before class, you go to class and then you're reviewing afterwards. But this is super important to continue that rehearsal cycle that we need. So for my people that are a little bit more logical, my numbers people, this can be helpful to really reinforce my reviewing is something that's so significant. So if you're looking at the top of this graph here, that arrow that points to when you first learn a new piece of information, within 3 days, if you follow that curve down, we've lost almost half of that information. So we're at 60% after 3 days. And so that's pretty significant. If you think about taking a class, if you have like a Tuesday, Thursday class, you learn something on a Thursday, or you do some homework on a Thursday, some reading, and then you don't have that class again until next Tuesday, how much of that information is going to be lost if you haven't looked at it or you haven't thought about it? Whereas if you are able to review your notes at some point or review your reading within 24 hours that first day, that curve is already getting so much less steep. You're retaining that information. It goes from 3 days to 7. And so, thinking about how fast our quarters go by, how much information we take in a week, that's hugely significant. And then, of course, every single time you're reviewing, that curve is getting a little bit less steep. We're flattening out the curve a little bit. And eventually, when it goes flat, that's when it's in our longer term memory. So review, 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 super important. So going over one more time, all the different steps, bringing it together. SQ4R, we're starting with our survey or our scan. We're asking some questions of ourselves. We're reading, recording or reciting, relating it to ourselves, and then that last step being review. So a couple FAQs, frequently asked questions with reading. When is the best time to read? Well, rule of thumb would always be to read before your lectures in the same way that we want to, scan through our reading before we dive right into it. We're priming our brain for the information we're about to take in and process. You want to prime yourself and get your brain ready to process all this information you're going to take in your lecture. And so reading is a good way to do that. You go in already knowing what they're going to talk about. But then that reviewing piece, always trying to review your readings and notes, hopefully within 24 hours of learning it, and definitely before you take your exams. This next question gets asked all the time. What is the best practice for handling these large amounts of reading that we're getting in some of our university classes? Couple strategies, tips that I usually give. First of all, using learning objectives as a lens, kind of a perspective for when you're reading. That can be really helpful. Sometimes it can seem overwhelming when we have like 30-page articles. Sometimes you have several of those to read for a class or a bunch of chapters that you need to read in a day. Looking at learning objectives, and if it's not chapters that you're reading, if it's articles, looking at the abstract at the beginning, looking at some of the subheadings, just getting a general sense of what is this article or this chapter or whatever you're reading going to be about? What does the author want me to learn and come away with? What are the takeaways? And so again, if you don't have questions or learning objectives set out for you, try making them yourself the same way that we talked through in the question section of this presentation, turning some subheadings or sections into questions. Second, take breaks. Because of all this information that we're trying to take in one sitting, if you're trying to just sit down and read for like 3 hours straight, after about 45 minutes or so, most of that information, you might be taking it in through your eyes, but it is definitely not being processed on that level that we want it to be to get it into our long-term memory. So take some breaks, even if it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, letting it sink in a little bit, taking an active break before you sit down and go again. And then prioritizing your time for the more difficult readings. A lot of times and it works differently for different people, right? So a lot of times we want to do the easier ones first, save the more difficult ones for last. But if we know that there are some that are going to be really confusing, that are going to take a little bit longer to get through, try doing those ones first so you can reward yourself with the shorter ones later. All right, now we're going to briefly go through structuring a study session that can be helpful for implementing SQ4R. Again, everyone's different. This is just one way to structure it, but this overall is all going to add up to 60 minutes. So that's why it can be particularly helpful for using SQ4R. So the first minute of this study session, we're setting a goal for ourselves. Again, this could be something in your head. You could write it down on a sticky note. But just taking a minute to come up with a tangible goal that you want to accomplish during this session. So it could be, how many pages do I want to read? How many articles or chapters am I trying to get through? Make it relevant, make it measurable in some way, but especially we want to make sure that this is able to be done in this 1 hour time frame. The next part, 30 to 50 minutes, somewhere in there, this is when you're doing the thing. You are reading, you're doing your read, record, relate. This is when SQ4R happens. Then we're taking a break. You're rewarding yourself. I always suggest, when we're doing reading, and especially during remote learning when everything we're doing is on a screen, try and close the screen or the book, do something active. So take a walk, eat a snack, make yourself a tea or a coffee so that you can be ready to come right back, get back into it a little bit refreshed. And then the last piece is taking a second or 5 minutes to review. So we're going over what we just looked at and we're just checking in with ourselves. Did I accomplish my goal? And if we set like a SMART goal that was measurable in some way, then we should be able to kind of check off, yes, I got it done, or no, I didn't. And then we're asking the question, well, if I didn't accomplish my goal, why or why not? Usually it's simple things like, I was pretty distracted. I had my phone next to me or had a whole bunch of different tabs up on my screen. So how can we do that differently next time? Can we put the phone on airplane mode? Can we close the different tabs on the screen? Maybe it's as simple as when we're studying at home, we need to close the door to our room, or we need to go into a room that has a door that we can close so we're not as distracted, so that we can get this 30 to 50 minute window of pure focus. So what? Just spent 20 minutes talking at you about these reading strategies that are going to go really in depth, that we're trying to, really engage with actively and be able to process our information on a deep level. Why would we put in all of this effort to read our articles? It obviously takes a little bit longer than just skimming through them, because in reality, the main thing that we're interested in here is that the more time we put in now in some of these middle weeks, or if you start out the term really strong at the beginning, the more time you put in now, the less time you put in later right before finals. We are able to, when we're processing our information in our long-term memory, then we don't have to go back in week 9 or 10 and be like, oh my goodness, what was this reading from week 2 or week 3 or 4? You already kind of have a good idea. Maybe you have some notes written down, and we don't have that same overwhelming pressure by the time we get to finals. All right, so main takeaways from this. Reading by nature is a passive activity, but there are lots of ways that we can make it actively engaging. In order to move information from our short-term memory to our long-term memory, it's necessary to review through repetition. make meaning out of the material whenever possible, and try and anchor this new information to things you've learned in the past. All right, now we're going to check in. Do you remember the different components of SQ4R? Take a second, try and think about it. Hopefully you were thinking survey, question, read, record, relate, review. Those are the different components. And if you found any part of this presentation confusing, or you thought that some of them were really interesting strategies you hadn't thought about before, you are always welcome to schedule an academic coaching appointment. Again, we talk about a lot of these same strategies just in a one-on-one appointment, so we can really kind of dive in and make sure that we're individualizing it to your own study habits. So a couple ways you can do this during virtual remote learning. You can email me directly. You can call our virtual front desk and we can schedule it that way, or you can fill out our academic coaching interest form, which is on the Learning Center website. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us, reach out. I hope this was helpful, and good luck with your reading.